So if you're looking at this image and wondering, how did she get the sun to just get at the proper angle to cast those shadows? Like, how did you set this whole scene up? Well, here's a little secret. There's no sun involved. I'm using an LED light and a kookalorus. If you've never heard of that, or if you know what it is, but you don't know how to use them, that's what we're gonna get into in this video. What's shakin' bacon? I'm Joni Simon. Welcome to my studio. This is where I do food photography, and the goal here is to improve your food photography skills so you can feel confident behind the camera. And today we're going to dive behind the scenes of this photo. I recently received a window from my friends over at Erickson Surfaces, and they're creating these really cool like false windows, which we refer to as a kookalorus in the industry, or a cookie, and that we can move the light around behind that kookalorus, behind that prop window, and get the lighting pattern that we're going for, just in terms of creating some really cool shadow play. So it creates this look that it looks like the sun is beaming through the window and casting the shadows through those panes, and it just creates this sort of really interesting atmosphere. Now, Erickson offers a lot of different like window styles. I put it to a vote over on Instagram which one y'all wanted to see, and this was the big winner. So I took the opportunity to kind of play around, get creative, and have some fun with it. So as I was planning for this shoot, you know, the question I always ask myself is like, what's the story going on here? What are we trying to communicate? And as I looked at this window and just the shape of it, really brought to mind kind of mission style architecture, and the architecture here in Arizona in the Southwest, especially like older buildings or like churches, things like that. And so in kind of pondering that and looking at some different Mexican art and thinking about color palettes, I was inspired to create this orange background. Like, I literally had a dream about it. This is the magic of creativity, is when you start to kind of mull over an idea in your mind, and then you wake up and you're like, oh, I have to go create that. And so that's how this orange background happened for me. And I used my DIY backdrops method. So if you've missed that video, I'll link it down below. But super happy with how this turned out. There's like a lot of yellow infused into it because I wanted to create sort of this sense of warmth and kind of this Southwest inspired still life. And so then as far as the surface, then on the bottom there, I'm using an Erickson Surfaces concrete kind of, well, I mean, it's a painted background, but it's got the concrete finish on it. And so I thought that made a lot of sense, that I've got such a bold background. So we'll go with something a little bit more muted and a little more subtle than on the surface, and with just a little bit more like cool contrast, so that it can really make that orange, and then also all the fruits that I knew I was going to be shooting, make them pop. So now the thing about working with these false windows, or in situations where we're really going to kind of get creative with the lighting, is one thing that can help, and I've talked about before, is to use a subject that's able to sit for a while and that you can really kind of like change things up and play with it, that it's not going to fade quickly. So I knew kind of setting up a still life scene with these fruits, that they could just sit there for hours as I kind of like fiddle with the light and decide like what direction do I want the shadows to cast, all that jazz, without having to worry about the food itself. So then as far as like selecting the fruits that I was going to shoot, I went ahead and again kind of continued that storyline of, okay, if we're going for Southwest inspired, we're going for kind of Mexican flavors, then I selected specific fruits that would be found and popular here and in Mexico. So obviously those little habanero peppers, very, very important. Now we're going to get to the lighting in just a moment, I promise. You're like, when is she going to talk about how to use the lights? Don't worry, we'll get there. I just want to make sure to kind of set you up for how I styled this scene. As far as like the composition for this setup, I knew that I wanted kind of that head-on angle so that I could see the background, because I wanted the light coming through the window to hit both the background and the surface. So I knew that the camera angle that I needed to be more head-on. And so then building out like how I arranged the fruits on the plate, at first it was sort of like this very kind of like horizontal line was happening, and it was cool, but I just was like, I want a bit more height. I want something more elevated. So thinking about sort of that triangular pattern, which if you start to pay attention to a lot of still life paintings across all sorts of genres, you start to really notice a theme of kind of that triangular. It's a really strong, solid composition to build on. And so as I was pulling things in, I was like, okay, I need a little height. So that's when then the watermelon came in, but it needed a little more height. So I pulled in just this little dish, which just gave it like an inch more height so that it would just slightly rise above all the other fruit in the scene. And then I I was like, I just need one more thing. And this is when I went to my props collection. And you know, you've got those props that you have, that you bought at some point, that you're like, oh, this would be so fun to use, and then you never do. Well, this was the moment for the copper pitcher that I found this. I don't know if this was like somebody's antique, like a family member, or I bought it in an antique store. Like, I don't even remember where I got this one, but I've had it for a long time, and it was like, this is the moment. This is the reason I have this prop. And so I just like placed it in the scene, and I'm like, done. We found it, right? It creates that really nice triangular sort of feeling of the composition. It's very strong, it's very bold, it's cohesive, it's interesting, and it also really plays well then with being able to show off the background as well as the surface and the way that the lighting is playing. So now on to the lighting. So the windows showed up, and of course the creative juices started flowing. I was marinating on different ideas, but ultimately I knew I'd need to do a bit of set building, because you've got the window, but you need to kind of set it up in such a way to create this environment and this convincing sort of look that this is an actual real window. And how would a real window look and be positioned relative to our subjects in, say, a kitchen or a dining room, wherever this scene is happening. So I had this surface, the gray surface, there on 2 sawhorses, which is like my typical go-to setup for shooting. And then I knew I needed to kind of like hang the window, and I was really intentional about thinking about, okay, I need the window physically close enough so that I can get the shadows projected on the background, but I also need it kind of like high enough up so that, you know, you think about how are windows placed in real life, in a real room. Like, they're not just physically right at the countertop level, they're just slightly above, slightly raised. So I created sort of that little windowsill effect there on the bottom. And this is always going to be my approach when I'm thinking about scenes like this, and lighting in general, as I think about how would the sun be behaving? How would the window be placed relative to the scene? Like, what are things that I can pay attention to in my real life environment and incorporate that into how I set things up with my lighting? So to hang the window, I just used 2 clamps on either end and then threaded those onto the boom arm of a C-stand. We've talked about how C-stands are infinitely helpful. Here's just another situation where I'm using one. And so that got the window at a high enough position that it was kind of placed where I wanted it. But then we have to think about the fact of, okay, well, in real life, when we have a window, there's then walls, right? That the walls are blocking any sort of light that'd be coming in. So that's when I busted out my favorite thing in the world, the black foam core, which, if you haven't purchased black foam core before, I get it usually at like places like Staples or other like office supply stores, craft supply stores. You can find it on Amazon. But I just then mounted that to the window using A-clamps. Again, something else I've talked about here that's infinitely helpful. And so again, this is sort of that set building, sort of the process of how do I create this wall with this window that looks like a window would look in real life. And then as far as that orange background, that back wall, that one's fortunately kind of a tall enough background that all I have to do is just lean it up against the surface and it stays in place, creating a wall for us. So once I had the set all built out, then I introduced the light to the scene. And I actually did this before even adding the fruit to the scene, just so I could really play with and experiment with the position and how that affected those shadows, and I recommend you do the same. But one of the things that I did choose in this setup was specifically to work with a continuous light source, because I think when we're working with situations where we've got very dramatic, very overt and specific shadows, that we're incorporating these shadows as elements of the composition in and of themselves. So by having a continuous light source, we can see in real time kind of like how our light and how those shadows are moving as we move our light. Now, you can certainly work with a strobe or a flash that has a modeling light so that you can kind of get that same sort of idea. But I do think there is something just really nice for situations like this where we're making some major manipulations of the shadows to see how they change in real time. And to not just being able to see them like in the scene, but then see what that image is going to look like. So in this situation, I was shooting tethered into Capture One and had the live view going on the computer so that then I could see, okay, as I physically move move this light, what's it doing to the shadows? What's it doing to my composition? Do I like how that looks? And see actually like what's the camera seeing, which is also super helpful for really nailing a killer composition. Now maybe you're also noticing that this is just a bare light. I don't have any additional modifiers on the light, and that's intentional because I want that hard light so that I get very clear and direct and defined shadows. That if we start to add things like soft boxes and diffusion material, that starts to soften our light, but then that also softens those lines of those shadows, that the transition from dark to light becomes softer and more gradual, making these shadows a little less apparent. So even if you were working with like quarter stop diffusion material, super thin, it's really going to knock down that contrast and kind of take away from, I think, the artistic patterns that we're mostly going for when we're working with kookaloruses and setups like this. And so then at that point, it's just a matter of kind of that trial and error and moving things around, seeing how the light changes as we change the position. And maybe one thing that you're noticing, you're looking at, you're thinking, holy cow, you've really got that light like super high up. Like, what's the deal with that? Well, that's really helping to cast those shadows downward and more directly and keeping them within the composition of the frame. But two, it also makes sense from the standpoint of we're trying to create this sunlight look, and where is the sun in the sky relative to a window? Going to be pretty high up. Now it depends on the time of the day, right? So this is then where we can further manipulate and think about if our light is representing the sun, and then of course our kookalorus is the window, what would the sun be doing for the look that we're going for? So as far as the light and the position that I landed with for the final image, I really liked it in such a way that it created some nice brightness there on the surface, on the gray area, so that it could show and illuminate the fruit and the plate, but then we'd get a really nice strong shadow where the wall is falling, right? So that is kind of blocking that light. I think it helps to frame this scene, really zero in the eyes to the subject. But then we've got those really nice diagonals going on, which are because of the position of that light relative to that window. Those are going to be those horizontal bars. They're going to cast in this direction just because of how I've placed that light. And I think that helps to kind of draw the eyes through the scene. But then we've got that vertical bar, which is still continuing to be vertical, and I've kind of got it set off to the side. Again, really helping to frame out this scene, but just add a little bit of contrast. And I think it also really nicely contrasts then with that copper pitcher by having a part of that pitcher in the shadow. It just helps to, again, also define that subject, help to separate it from the background. And I mean, I'm just living for that little golden highlight that's just like falling on the edge of that pitcher. Like, that is not Photoshop. That's no like sort of magic. That's just the light doing its thing. And it just, it's like one of those moments where you're like, oh, I love that. Now, one other thing to notice about this setup is the large V flat with the dark side. I've got the black there on the left. And that's just helping to block some of the ambient light in the space. I have not finished the window treatments here in the new studio. So during the day, I do get a certain amount of ambient light coming in from the windows. So that was just helping to block some of the natural light windows that are in the studio to help create kind of this cleaner lighting look and help to really add that depth and dimension. Because when we have light entering from too many directions into our scene, it can create light pollution, contributing to a flat feeling in our images. Now, one other thing about this image that's definitely atypical of what I usually do in terms of camera settings was I dialed in an aperture of f/22 because I really wanted a lot of focus all the way from the front, all the way to the back, so that all of that subject matter, all of those fruits were in focus. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, you know that I share my camera settings with nearly every photo I post, and I live in that neighborhood of like f/3.2 to like f/7.1, f/9 at the most. So like going all the way to f/22, definitely outside of my typical comfort zone, but also because I'm shooting with continuous light source in this situation, I'm compensating for that small aperture opening that's allowing for that wider depth of field. I'm compensating by going with a slower shutter speed. And so for the final image, I ended up with a shutter speed of 1/1/3 of a second. Again, I'm usually 1/200th of a second because I'm shooting strobes, but in this case, we're like, let's just slow it down and do something different. And I encourage you to do the same. You know, if you typically shoot in one way all the time, I mean, talk about a way to get in a rut, look for opportunities to shake loose, try something different. But so between the storytelling and the DIY background and the kookalorus and the LED light and the different kinds of camera settings, hopefully this is shaking loose some different ideas for you, giving you some ideas to marinate on to create your own beautiful images. But thank you as always for stopping by. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. But with that, you stay out of trouble and I'll see you soon. All right? Bye.